Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. Seems like just a few minutes ago that we were doing the last one, so I don't have a great deal of preamble. I hope you don't mind. I hope you really just want to get right down to it. Okay, let's start reading chapter 29. I found that no genius in another could please me. My unfortunate paradoxes had entirely dried up that source of comfort. One morning, some weeks after her arrival at Lowick, Dorothea, but why always Dorothea? Was her point of view the only possible one with regard to this marriage? I protest against all our interest, all our effort at understanding being given to the young skins that look blooming in spite of trouble, for these too will get faded and will know the older and more eating griefs which we are helping to neglect. In spite of the blinking eyes and white moles objectionable to Celia, and the want of muscular curve which was morally painful to Sir James, Mr. Casaubon had an intense consciousness within him, and was spiritually a-hungered like the rest of us. He had done nothing exceptional in marrying, nothing but what society sanctions and considers an occasion for wreaths and bouquets. It had occurred to him that he must not any longer defer his intention of matrimony, and he had reflected that in taking a wife, a man of good position should expect and carefully choose a blooming young lady, the younger the better, because more educable and submissive, of a rank equal to his own, of religious principles, virtuous disposition, and good understanding. On such a young lady he would make handsome settlements, and he would neglect no arrangement for her happiness. In return, he should receive family pleasures and leave behind him that copy of himself which seems so urgently required of a man to the sonneteers of the 16th century. Times had altered since then, and no sonneteer had insisted on Mr. Casaubon's leaving a copy of himself. Moreover, he had not yet succeeded in issuing copies of his mythological key, but he had always intended to acquit himself by marriage, and the sense that he was fast leaving the years behind him, that the world was getting dimmer, and that he felt lonely, was a reason to him for losing no more time in overtaking domestic delights before they too were left behind by the years. And when he had seen Dorothea, he believed that he had found even more than he demanded. She might really be such a helpmate to him as would enable him to dispense with a hired secretary, an aid which Mr. Casaubon had never yet employed and had a suspicious dread of. Mr. Casaubon was nervously conscious that he was expected to manifest a powerful mind. Providence, in its kindness, had supplied him with the wife he needed, a wife, a modest young lady, with the purely appreciative, unambitious abilities of her sex, is sure to think her husband's mind powerful. Whether Providence had taken equal care of Miss Brooke in presenting her with Mr. Casaubon was an idea which could hardly occur to him. Society never made the preposterous demand that a man should think as much about his own qualifications for making a charming girl happy as he thinks of hers for making himself happy. As if a man could choose not only his wife but his wife's husband, or as if he were bound to provide charms for his posterity in his own person. When Dorothea accepted him with effusion, that was only natural, and Mr. Casaubon believed that his happiness was going to begin. He had not had much foretaste of happiness in his previous life. To know intense joy without strong bodily frame, one must have an enthusiastic soul. Mr. Casaubon had never had a strong bodily frame, and his soul was sensitive without being enthusiastic. It was too languid to thrill out of self-consciousness into passionate delight. It went on fluttering in the swampy ground where it was hatched, thinking of its wings and never flying. His experience was of that pitiable kind which shrinks from pity and fears most of all that it should be known. It was that proud, narrow sensitiveness which has not mass enough to spare for transformation into sympathy, and quivers, thread-like, in small currents of self-preoccupation, or at best, of an egoistic scrupulosity. And Mr. Casaubon had many scruples. He was capable of a severe self-restraint. He was resolute in being a man of honour according to the code. He would be unimpeachable by any recognized opinion. In conduct, these ends had been attained, but the difficulty of making his key to all mythologies unimpeachable weighed like lead upon his mind, and the pamphlets, or parerga, as he called them, by which he tested his public and deposited small, monumental records of his march, were far from having been seen in all their significance. He suspected the Archdeacon of not having read them. He was in painful doubt as to what was really thought of them by the leading minds of Brasenose, and bitterly convinced that his old acquaintance Carp had been the writer of that depreciatory recension which was kept locked in a small drawer of Mr. Casaubon's desk, and also in a dark closet of his verbal memory. These were heavy impressions to struggle against, and brought that melancholy embitterment which is the consequence of all excessive claim. Even his religious faith wavered with his wavering trust in his own authorship, and the consolations of the Christian hope in immortality seemed to lean on the immortality of the still unwritten key to all mythologies. For my part, I am very sorry for him. It is an uneasy lot at best to be what we call highly taught, and yet not to enjoy, to be present at this great spectacle of life, and never to be liberated from a small, hungry, shivering self, never to be fully possessed by the glory we behold, never to have our consciousness rapturously transformed into the vividness of a thought, the ardour of a passion, the energy of an action, but always to be scholarly and uninspired, ambitious and timid, scrupulous and dim-sighted. Becoming a dean or even a bishop would have made little difference, I fear, to Mr. Casaubon's uneasiness. Doubtless some ancient Greek has observed that behind the big mask and the speaking trumpet there must always be our poor little eyes peeping as usual, and our timorous lips more or less under anxious control. To this mental estate, mapped out a quarter of a century before, to sensibilities thus fenced in, Mr. Casaubon had thought of annexing happiness with a lovely young bride. But even before marriage, as we have seen, he found himself under a new depression in the consciousness that the new bliss was not blissful to him. Inclination yearned back to its old, easier custom, and the deeper he went in domesticity, the more did the sense of acquitting himself and acting with propriety predominate over any other satisfaction. Marriage, like religion and erudition, nay, like authorship itself, was fated to become an outward requirement, and Edward Casaubon was bent on fulfilling unimpeachably all requirements, even drawing Dorothea into use in his study according to his own intention before marriage, was an effort which he was always tempted to defer, and but for her pleading insistence it might never have begun. But she had succeeded in making it a matter of course that she should take her place at an early hour in the library, and have work either of reading aloud or copying assigned her. The work had been easier to define because Mr. Casaubon had adopted an immediate intention. There was to be a new parergon, a small monograph on some lately traced indications concerning the Egyptian mysteries, whereby certain assertions of Warburton's could be corrected. References were extensive even here, but not altogether shoreless, and sentences were actually to be written in the shape wherein they would be scanned by Brasenose and a less formidable posterity. These minor, monumental productions were always exciting to Mr. Casaubon. Digestion was made difficult by the interference of citations, or by the rivalry of dialectical phrases ringing against each other in his brain, and from the first there was to be a Latin dedication, about which everything was uncertain except that it was not to be addressed to Carp. It was a poisonous regret to Mr. Casaubon that he had once addressed a dedication to Carp, in which he had numbered that member of the animal kingdom among the viros nullo evo pereturos, a mistake which would infallibly lay the dedicator open to ridicule in the next age, and might even be chuckled over by Pike and Tench in the present. Thus Mr. Casaubon was in one of his busiest epochs, and as I begin to say a little while ago, Dorothea joined him early in the library, where he had breakfasted alone. Celia at this time was on a second visit to Lowick, probably the last before her marriage, and was in the drawing-room, expecting Sir James. Okay, let's get started with the epigraph, of course. It's the start of a new chapter. Today's epigraph comes from the novel The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith, published in 1766. It's a novel I have read, but it was so long ago. I mean, it must be getting close to half a century. I might as well say I haven't read it. Might as well read it again. I did read most of chapter 20 online in preparation for this meditation, because that's where the quote comes from. So forgive me, I'm going to read my notes a little bit just to make sure I give you all the information I took down. The character speaking in this epigraph is George. He's a young man who went to London to seek his fortune, to find a good job suitable for someone with an education. He travels to London for the usual reason. London is a big city and he'll have the greatest number of job opportunities, he believes. And his initial idea is to be an usher for a private academy. Most schools were private. There was no such thing as a state-funded education at that time. And this job title will be confusing because we think of ushers as minor officiates at ceremonies and performances, you know, those lovely people who direct audience members to where they should be, where they should sit, etc. But in the 18th century, an usher was effectively a teacher's assistant. Anyway, George is persuaded by a friend not to try for an usher's job. His cousin apparently has tried, and he's found that the working conditions are horrible. The wages are very poor. So George tries his hand at freelance writing. In the first half of the 18th century, publishing as we know it in England, it was in its formative years, but it was growing. It was already noticeable. Freedom of the press was greater, compared with what had been the norm before that. Large-scale publishing and distribution businesses were just beginning. Percentage literacy was just increasing. And so there were also, of course, markets overseas due to colonial expansion. So this was a business worth looking into, and businesses were growing. What I found interesting about Goldsmith's depiction of George is that there is already, in this early developmental time, the critical split between what was considered literary and highbrow and what was considered popular writing. And maybe at this point in history, it's more clear that the split is driven by the need to appeal to different audiences. So on one hand, you've got the larger, newly literate population that desired really just regular reading material about subjects that they might be able to grasp easily because they don't have much education beyond becoming literate. And then, of course, you had, on the other hand, a much smaller group, you educated men almost entirely, a coterie, a clique, if you like. And these were the men meeting in the lovely new coffee shops that were becoming popular. Men who'd been educated to understand classical Greek and Latin literature, men who could afford to own their own books in quantity, and they could afford the kind of homes with storage space for those books. So this is a tiny group of people, and among them, many held high positions in the Church of England, because, of course, the whole purpose for the universities of Oxford and Cambridge at the time was really to just produce educated clergymen. And so George, our character from Goldsmith's novel, At first, he wants to write in order to appeal to this small, highly educated little coterie in London. And what holds him back, he says, is essentially nepotism and cronyism. The literary coterie or clique, they tend to promote the writing of people that they know or people much like themselves in terms of background. George is a rank outsider. The literary coterie, they don't even notice what he writes. And so George, he's left with the option of now writing for the broader public, but it helps his wallet. You know, he makes a living, and yet he's troubled. And I'm going to read from the chapter now, and you're going to see Eliot's epigraph turn up in the second paragraph. Having a mind too proud to stoop to such indignities, and yet a fortune too humble to hazard a second attempt for fame, I was now obliged to take a middle course and write for bread. But I was unqualified for a profession where mere industry alone was to ensure success. I could not suppress my lurking passion for applause, but usually consumed that time in efforts after excellence, which takes up but little room when it should have been more advantageously employed in the diffusive productions of fruitful mediocrity. My little piece would therefore come forth in the mist of periodical publication, unnoticed and unknown. The public were more importantly employed than to observe the easy simplicity of my style, of the harmony of my periods. Sheet after sheet was thrown off to oblivion. My essays were buried among the essays upon liberty, Eastern tales, and cures for the bite of a mad dog, while Philautos, Philalethes, Phileleutheros, and Philanthropos all wrote better because they wrote faster than I. Now, therefore, I began to associate with none but disappointed authors like myself, who praised, deplored, and despised each other. The satisfaction we found in every celebrated writer's attempts was inversely as their merits. I found that no genius in another could please me. My unfortunate paradoxes had entirely dried up that source of comfort. I could neither read nor write with satisfaction, for excellence in another was my aversion, and writing was my trade. That word trade should be read with a sneer. The concept of writing to supply a demand for a product was looked down upon because producing a product to supply a demand was normally the responsibility of lower socioeconomic classes in England, those classes that had to work to survive, and they usually had to work with their hands. The upper classes did not have to produce anything on demand. They could produce writing by choice without a deadline and be confident that their work would gain the applause that young George is yearning for, because it was members of the upper classes who had sole access to higher education and also pretty much sole access to the recognition of their kind. Okay, so what has any of this got to do with chapter 29? Well, Eliot's close examination of Mr. Casaubon, his thoughts and his motives, demonstrates that his strongest drive was to present whatever he did in a way that would be considered flawless, unimpeachable. The narrator uses that word again and again. So flawless according to the standards of his time and place. And this is like Goldsmith's young George, who wants his writing to be excellent, to be applauded by the toughest critics of writing in his time and place. He wanted them to really enjoy the way he could work a sentence. And whereas Casaubon differs from George in that Casaubon, in spite having the upper class freedom to write at his own pace and having devoted, nearly a quarter of a century, it sounds like, to that writing, Casaubon has not produced a finished work that can be shown to the public and thereby receive the attention of his own class, his literary coterie, the higher churchmen who are his fellows. And for the first time, Eliot's narrator suggests that the reason the book has not been published is not that it's not finished. I think that's interesting. I had assumed, up until we read chapter 29, that this was the problem. I assumed that great portions of the book were still unwritten. Now I reconsider. Young George despaired because all his lovely writing was being published in smaller chunks in periodicals, which were read to be forgotten. You know what periodicals are like. The next issue comes along, you forget all about the previous one. He was troubled because his writing wasn't truly being noticed. Mr. Casaubon seems to have the same despair. And that's because the only thing he has published are small extracts from his Key to All Mythologies in pamphlet form. And these either were not noticed or worse, it sounds like one of them at least was attacked by a friend of his. So that's the epigraph. It gives us a good intro into this examination of Mr. Casaubon. But what I think is interesting is how early on the narrator breaks the fourth wall and says, I protest, me, the narrator, against all our interest. How peculiar. And not only that, they're accusing us, I think us, the reader, of being complicit in this crime of narrative bias. You know, all our effort at understanding given to the young skins who look blooming in spite of trouble. Now, we know that our decision about the characters we spend time with and how much we understand about them is 100% out of our hands and 100% in the narrator's power, which begs a question, what kind of narrator do we have here exactly? And my lecturers at university, they went to a lot of trouble to warn students that they must never confuse the narrator with the author of any book. They explained that a narrator and an author may have some aspects in common, and you can talk about that and discuss it, but the narrator must always be regarded as distinct in some way. And I admit that I rarely think of a narrator as a personality, and I probably should think about that more, and particularly here with Middlemarch, because there's a very interesting narrator here. What kind of person has Eliot created to tell us about Middlemarch? In this section, I must say, it seems that the narrator lacks self-awareness, and lacking awareness of what effect their words are going to have on the reader. Was it just me, or did you feel a little indignant when you were accused of only being interested in the younger characters, when you thought, well, what choice? But I'm not sure whether we could talk about Eliot's narrator in Middlemarch as a consistent personality. A blogger called Justin Goh Xian Qiang described the narrator of Middlemarch as one who has taken up many mantles. And that was interesting. Justin went on to say that the narrator of Middlemarch has had to act as historian, sometimes scientist, or sometimes as spiritual commenter, and I would also add a little bit of a proto-psychologist. And so perhaps, for the purposes of Middlemarch, we could talk about the narrator being a shapeshifter, perhaps, always adapting to what is needed at a particular point in the text. Or perhaps, and I just thought of this, what if the narrator of Middlemarch is actually multiple personalities? We don't tend to think of that. We always think of the narrator as one. You know, it's just an assumption that we fall back on. But what if the narrator of Middlemarch is more like a committee of commentators? If we go with that idea, just for the moment, right, entertain me, humor me, then it means that maybe the narrator in chapter 29 isn't telling off the readers, isn't talking to us, but telling off the other members of the narration committee. That certainly makes a lot more sense to me. But going on, there's a phrase the narrator uses about Mr. Casaubon. They say, not any longer defer his intention of matrimony. Now that interested me. It suggests that Mr. Casaubon had intended to marry for some time. Naturally, of course, we wonder how long and why have you waited? Well, you know, one question I would want to ask is, prior to Dorothea Brooke, had he ever found a young woman of his own class who met all his requirements? Because they're quite strict. Any speculations on this? Actually, viewers, I throw it out to you. Did Casaubon expect, perhaps, to finish his mythological key first, have it published and acclaimed, and etc., and then top it off by getting married? Or was getting married just an obligation that he felt he must submit to at some time, and he never really thought when, and you know, the book got in his way, and it's just something that keeps going to the bottom of his pile of things to do, his to-do list, if you like. And our narrator says that Mr. Casaubon felt lonely, And at least there we acknowledge some feeling of Casaubon's. He doesn't often show feeling. I do feel sorry for him. I think not everyone knows the best ways to make friends. We're all quirky in a way, but some people are quirky and they don't join in with whatever the popular thing currently is. And of course, that kind of behavior will make the number of people who will take you in as a friend a bit smaller. And Mr. Casaubon, he loves to study. He studies, and whether his studies are misguided or not, in terms of disciplining himself to read and to take notes and write, he's got no problem with that. But again, those kind of activities, they're very solitary. He's a little in need maybe of a life coach or a counselor to just suggest some rebalancing of his life, maybe make time for some activity that is more social, less intellectual, without considering that a waste of time. Maybe he's got to get past the sense that it would be a waste of time to do anything less intellectually demanding. And I'm reminded again of young George from Goldsmith's epigraph, feeling miserable because he's wasting all his good prose on light writing. Had he been accepted by the literary coterie of his day, and he only wrote or read what he considered to be serious, he might have become really unbalanced, just like Casaubon. I did note, though, on page 279, near the top, that there's something about Dorothea that Mr. Casaubon misunderstands, and we have heard it mentioned before, but the narrator calls it, he says that to Mr. Casaubon, a young woman has purely appreciative, unambitious abilities of her sex, and I don't think that's true of Dorothea. No, I think she is ambitious. I think she's ambitious within the limits to which a woman of her class might aspire. I think she has aspirations to do something great spiritually or charitably, find some work that would suit her. And yes, that could include researching and editing Mr. Casaubon's Key to All Mythologies. I think she thought that's where all her effort would be going, and hence her ambition, hence her constantly badgering her husband effectively so that she could do the copying and reading aloud work that she so much wanted, that he had promised initially, but then wished he could take back. And interesting also to note that Mr. Casaubon initially was relieved that Dorothea wanted to do this reading and copying because it saved him hiring a private secretary. And he was worried about doing that because he felt that anyone coming to work for him as a secretary would be wanting him to manifest a powerful mind. And it's clear that Casaubon understands himself. He understands he doesn't actually have a powerful mind. He's not actually some great genius in his field. And I think I've said this in earlier meditations, but I do wonder what his upbringing was like and if too much was expected of him. We've heard some talk of Casaubon's mother, some mention of her, but I wonder if Eliot will choose to say anything about Casaubon's father. Perhaps not, but if she had, it surely would have been a sad father and son story. I cannot help but think that all of Casaubon's strange hypersensitivity, which is focused entirely on himself and what he has or has not achieved, what he must and must not do, is the voice of one, the other, or both overbearing parents, and he cannot stop listening to this voice. Eliot's narrator says it, further down the page. They say, he had not had much foretaste of happiness in his previous life. The narrator also says that Casaubon never had a strong bodily frame. If there was patriarchal disapproval, this could have been the reason. I'm reminded of Philip Wakem in Eliot's The Mill on the Floss, although Philip's a bit different because his father does seem to carry and show some affection for him, does seem fond of him. But it wouldn't be difficult to imagine a father whose own ego is strongly invested in his son, and if that son doesn't fit the father's image of an ideal man, then the father might be angry, as if his son had chosen to disappoint his father and adversely affect his father's personal sense of security and identity. All Casaubon's scholarly efforts might be an attempt to compensate for the lack of a powerful body by trying to develop this powerful mind. But unfortunately, as our narrator goes on to describe, there isn't a powerful mind here. Casaubon is described as sensitive but not enthusiastic, not inclined to be passionate about anything. The narrator calls his mind languid, which means lacking energy and vigor. This might be connected to Casaubon's physiological weakness. He might have a physical disorder with symptoms that affect his ability to concentrate or give him periods of fatigue. In those days, there wouldn't have been sufficient medical knowledge to reach a diagnosis, let alone think about treatment. And there's a vocabulary word we need to pick up from the bottom of page 279, parerga, or in the plural, pareragon. I found it hard with those two R's to pronounce it correctly. Never mind. The 2018 Oxford English Dictionary defines pareragon as something subordinate or accessory to the main subject. So the term has been used in art criticism for the examination of, as an example, the details in a painting that are not the subject of the painting, such as background objects. In writing, it could be that portion of a book that's not part of the main text but supplements it. So, for example, footnotes, appendices, or an epigraph, as it happens. What it seems Casaubon has done is publish something like an appendix or a longer footnote in the form of a pamphlet, a brief essay discussing a topic that borders on his unpublished work, The Key to All Mythologies. And we know he has published several of these pamphlets, but the purpose was to test public reaction, and you can tell by the text how that went. He's not sure that anyone he knows has read them, but that means he certainly had no feedback except that one article which he suspects was written by Carp. He doesn't know. In the early 18th century, there was a lot of stuff published anonymously, and there was good reason for doing it. If you read a biography of Jonathan Swift, you will soon learn it was a very foolish thing to be to name yourself sometimes in writing if you were going to attack someone, because people took the law into their own hands still a little bit, more so in the 18th century. I think it would be more a problem in Jonathan Swift's day. To take personal revenge slowly became regarded as illegal, but going back in English history to defend your own honor, even if that meant killing another person, was quite acceptable, at least among the higher classes. And Mr. Carp's piece of writing, if indeed Carp did write it, was referred to as a depreciatory recension. Now, recension, I had to look it up. Okay, I didn't know. It's a term used in textual criticism, and it's often used in the criticism of ancient texts where you're questioning authenticity or authorship or the age of the text that you're looking at. How old is it really? So a depreciatory recension of Mr. Casaubon's pamphlets would, I think, be a piece of writing critically examining Casaubon's work, and clearly in the mind of the critic, Mr. Casaubon's work was not regarded as anything truly groundbreaking, and perhaps demonstrating, using the critic's greater learning, that Casaubon's ideas were derivative of earlier writers whose works have been discredited since. I mean, that would sync perfectly with Will Ladislaw's comments to Dorothea, that Casaubon's scholarship was too narrow, out of date, didn't go to the places where it should do. And shame on Casaubon, really, because he's read that critique and he's not learned from it. He's locked it up in a drawer in his desk, and he just feels bitter about it. And he just spends all his time speculating on, is the author Carp his old acquaintance? And he doesn't have the courage to go face his critic and either defend himself if he feels capable, or if he doesn't, if he knows the recension is correct, why doesn't he have the courage to ask for advice? I see why the narrator uses the metaphor of a bird for Casaubon, his soul just flapping its wings but never flies. You cannot really learn if you cannot be comfortable about being wrong. Now, it's at this point in the narrative on page 280 that the narrator admits that they feel very sorry for Mr. Casaubon. I must admit, at this point, my sympathy wavered a little bit. I might have had more sympathy with him as a younger man, because, to be young and to do or think something stupid, not ready to be said yet, that's a characteristic of being young. Have we not all done something that we look back on and go, ooh? And nobody's ever avoided it, I don't think. But the narrator says This mental estate mapped out a quarter of a century before. It's like, what? Casaubon's 42 now. I think that's old enough to look back on your youthful stupidity, whatever it is, and recognize it for what it is and not be ashamed of it. Just accept it, own it. I think a lot of people do some kind of pivot in midlife. It might be a career change, the ending of a relationship, or changing what you think about a subject. For someone who studies beyond formal school, I expect them to be continually learning, gaining new perspectives on things. I expect them to have admitted being wrong and needing to change and looking back on things with some regret, but thinking, okay, we move forward. I expect that, and I'm kind of disappointed that Mr. Casaubon's education hasn't afforded him even that ability. And it goes without saying that a person who's not comfortable about being wrong and has not changed their opinions in a quarter of a century shouldn't get married. Shouldn't. The narrator reminds us how early on in the engagement Mr. Casaubon had regrets. And why? Why? Because the marriage was going to ask him to change. Oh my goodness, things would be required of him that were not required before. Oh, I can give the older Casaubon some sympathy, because if you've been single for a long time, if you get married late, it can be tougher to adapt. And if he's also not well, and I have to allow that. I don't know how unwell. I don't know what Mr. Casaubon feels like every day he gets up and tries to go about doing the normal things he does. Maybe it's a struggle every day. So, I gotta give him that. So maybe I have to back up a little bit from my lack of sympathy and go, he's had a chronic illness, perhaps, all his life that has affected his energy levels. How much change is he going to feel able to cope with? Is it always going to cause him a great deal of stress when his life circumstances alter a bit and suddenly there's more demanded of him? I take that on board. Now, dear viewers, I came to the part in my script that was supposed to cover page 281 and found that it was blank. I cannot remember if I wrote something in here and accidentally deleted it, or if I assumed the script was finished and had not got to page 281 and forgot I needed to fill it in. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to close off this meditation as I normally do, and I will pick up on any points that I should have made about page 281, because I believe there's a mention of Warburton with a footnote in my edition of the book, and I want to cover that. So expect a couple of little remarks in the next Middlemarch meditation, which, yes, will be in July, but don't worry, I'll give you lots of backup so that I can remind you where we were and what we were talking about, maybe even read the text again. So we'll do that, because I've clearly made a boo-boo, and here I am filming and thinking, uh-oh, but we'll fix it. We'll fix it. So I guess that means today's meditation is done. And I hope you guys have had a successful June. I want to say right now, because it is the last day of June and I'm hoping this video will go out today, is that I am almost 300 pages in credit at the end of June. That is, I was able to meet my page target and exceed it by nearly 300 pages. So to me, the adjustments that I made at the end of May, beginning of June, to try to help myself get more reading done, that seems to be working really well. I've also included a couple of audiobooks this month, and they're extra to requirements. They have helped with the page count, and I will talk about them. But I think what I'm finding with audiobooks is I'm choosing titles that are lighter, where I don't worry so much about retention. I don't feel that's the point. I'm perhaps just wanting to be told a story or be given some information that I think is personal to me, but may not be to other viewers. And so I'll probably find a way to mention those audiobooks. Maybe I'll wait until a couple of months are done, maybe 3 months. Maybe I'll do a quarterly audiobook review and just quickly talk about them so that you can know what I've listened to. But I won't do full reviews because I don't retain as much with audiobooks as I do with print books. And it's very difficult, obviously, to look back on them and prepare a script. So I'm just choosing books that are, I suppose, light entertainment for me, a little bit more relaxing books that I think, I'm just going to enjoy this. I don't need to tell anybody about it or evaluate it. And I did like that. I felt that was a lovely counterpoint to the reading I'm doing that I do review, because I read differently then, and I'm often taking notes and annotating the book, and that takes a little bit more time. And so it was lovely to listen to a story and just have no other reason to be listening to it except to be entertained and to enjoy it. And so, yeah, I will talk about that, but that'll probably be fit in some kind of, say, half-yearly or quarterly update, something like that. Anyway, everybody, I hope your June has gone really well. If it hasn't, don't despair. Life is like that. Pick up again in July. Carry on where you left off. Okay, everyone, I'll see you again this next weekend with a non-fiction review. In the meantime, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.